learning in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are very grateful to you, Mr. Vargas, for accepting our invitation. Professor Shankar Das, the Vice Chancellor, could not be here with us today, unfortunately, to chair this session due to certain urgent commitments. So we are thankful to Professor Archana Mandale for kindly stepping in to chair the session. Dr. Archana Mandale is adjunct professor at CETE. She has worked in the areas of education, law, and policy, regulation, inclusive education, and child rights. She was a member of the committee set up by the Central Advisory Board of Education of the Government of India to frame the Right to Education Bill in 2005. She also served as a member of the expert group that provided the final round of feedback on the Abidjan Principles on the human rights obligations of states to provide public education and to regulate private involvement in education. Since 2017, Archana has led research work on innovative finance for education at our center. With this, I invite Professor Archana Mandale to give her opening remarks and chair the session. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chandran. Good evening, everyone, especially participants who are there in person. And also, I can see there are several participants who have joined online from different time zones. Thank you all for coming today for this first lecture in the 3-lecture series. On the eve of Teachers' Day celebrations in India, I'm happy to be part of this 3-lecture series, and I feel honored to chair the first lecture to be delivered by our esteemed guest, Dr. Carlos Vargas. Before I invite him to address us, I would like to very briefly place before you the larger context and importance of today's topic of discussion. All of us here are familiar with the UN Agenda 2030, SDG 4, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, is part of the United Nations broader 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And periodic monitoring and tracking progress towards these SDGs, especially SDG 4, allows governments, organizations, and communities to assess effectiveness, identify gaps, and make necessary adjustments to educational policies and practices. Discussing Sustainable Development Goal 4 is crucial at this moment for several reasons. First of all, we are experiencing a kind of a global education crisis that we had not imagined until now. And this is due to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, which significantly disrupted education worldwide. We are also familiar with the learning losses that occurred due to school closures and interruptions. And addressing these gaps has been an urgent challenge for countries, particularly since these losses could create long-term setbacks for education and development. Secondly, research is showing us that there are widening disparities. There have been disparities even before the pandemic, and they continue to widen, particularly affecting marginalized groups, especially girls, children with disabilities, children living in rural and remote areas, as they continue to face barriers to access quality education. And addressing these disparities is becoming crucial for bringing social equity and justice. Thirdly, we are also seeing more conversations around technological innovations and their role in educational advancement. Even though the reality of digital divide and access to technology remains a significant challenge in most countries, education systems globally are suddenly thrown against the wall as they are yet to fully assess the impact that new technologies and artificial intelligence could have on the aims and purposes of education. Fourthly, we know that education is key to building inclusive societies and fostering social cohesion and for building empowered and sustainable societies. Yet, schools and education systems could see roadblocks on account of fractured and divided social fabric. And it is within these contextual challenges that a school teacher has to stand tall and teach her class. While teachers play a very crucial role in shaping societies and educating future generations, their status, working conditions vary widely across the world. And our invited expert this evening, Dr. Carlos Vargas, will share with us valuable insights about the status of teachers globally based on the Global Report on Teachers, which was launched by UNESCO in 2024. So I now invite Dr. Vargas to deliver his lecture. I request all the members of the audience to kindly make a note of all the questions and comments that they may have. We have currently disabled the chat function while the speaker is making the presentation. But I request all of you to make note of these questions and comments, and you will have an opportunity to ask them after the presentation. Over to you, Dr. Vargas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Archana, for this kind introduction and for setting the scene for this conversation around teachers and the importance of teaching. I'm very happy and very grateful with the Center for Excellence in Teacher Education, with the Tata Institute for this invitation, particularly as you're commemorating the Teachers' Day in India. So first of all, congratulations to all of those in the room and online who are teachers or who are studying to be teachers or who would like to become teachers at some point. I think it is a very good day to commemorate the profession. Just to share with you, as you know, we celebrate World Teachers' Day globally a month from now, on the 5th of October, which is the commemoration of the adoption of the 1966 recommendation concerning the status of teachers. It's a joint recommendation you might be familiar with. It was adopted by all member states. It's a UNESCO and International Labour Organization recommendation. But we're very happy, of course, to also participate in national events. This year, the theme of World Teachers' Day has to do with the voice of teachers, with their participation in educational policymaking, the importance of this, and I will make reference to that throughout my presentation. In order to transform education, we need to think of teachers in a different way. So this year's theme is valuing teacher voices towards a new social contract for education. So I believe that the presentation today will very much speak to that. So let me just share my screen let me just share here. Let me see if you can see it.
We can see it online. Can the audience organizers, someone in the room confirm you are able to see the screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so this is the report that UNESCO and the Teacher Task Force launched just a few months back in February 2024 in Johannesburg, and which focuses on teacher shortages. The report looks, and I will walk you through it, what are some of the causes, what are some of the consequences of the global lack of teachers we have in the world, and how we can actually work together to transform the profession. As Archana was mentioning, this report comes in a very timely, I would say, moment, and it has to do with some of the principles, some of the international commitments that Archana mentioned. As you know, this is within Sustainable Development Goal 4. If you remember, it is about equitable and quality education for all and lifelong learning opportunities as well. And there's different targets within SDG 4, within the goal. And target 4.c is particularly focused on teachers. This target 4.c It basically encapsulates the international community's commitment to improve their recruitment, the retention, and especially the qualifications of teachers, so that every learner in the world is taught by a motivated, supported, qualified, and well-resourced teacher. So that's something important. You might remember this Sustainable Development Goal 4 was adopted in 2015, and we're aiming to achieve it, to achieve this ambition of education for all at all levels by 2030. And for that, of course, we need teachers. So it is in this context of trying to measure progress towards SDG 4 and particularly target 4.C that we have produced this report. This report has two sections. One of them is monitoring the targets of 4.C to look at teacher qualification, to look at their working conditions, to look at pupil-teacher ratios, and other elements that are indicators of good quality, but also of good working conditions for teachers. So it has a monitoring section. So we will be publishing this report every 2 years to monitor progress that countries make towards the achievement of SDG 4.C in particular. But then it has a second section, which is thematic. And in this first issue of the global report, we have chosen the issue of global teacher shortages because it is a global one. It is not only something that happens in the global south. It is not something that is specific of low-income countries. This is something that we are seeing throughout the world, and India is also included in this. I will not spoil the data that Padma and colleagues have prepared, and you'll probably see 2 days from today to measure and dimension the size of the challenge in India. I will speak more globally. But maybe just to share with you that this report is inspired by a few normative instruments. As I said before, the 1966 ILO UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of teachers, the 1997 UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel. These are normative instruments, the only ones globally that speak about the rights, the obligations of teachers, but particularly of education systems to support the work of teachers. Now, you might remember as well the work of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which actually published a report. It's called Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, that came up in 2021. And I would rather invite you to read chapter 5, which focuses particularly on transforming the teaching profession. What are some of the ideas for that transformation, which I will touch upon a little later. And finally, an important, I would say an important moment towards the 2030, towards the Sustainable Development Goals, was the Transforming Education Summit that we had convened by the United Nations in 2022. It is important because this summit addressed the main issues why SDG 4 is not making progress, the main obstacles of education and that countries face in actually achieving good quality, equitable education for all, and then to identify what were some of the levers, some of the solutions that could be made to improve progress towards SDG 4. In that summit in New York, the Secretary General of the United Nations launched a high-level panel on the teaching profession. This is a group of experts that came together. It was steered by UNESCO and the ILO, and tomorrow my colleague Oliver Liang from the ILO will be speaking more of these recommendations. But just for you to know that these recommendations are also an international agreement on how to move forward in improving the teaching profession in the years to come, bearing in mind the progress that we need to make to actually address SDG 4. So that's a little bit of the context where this report comes from. But maybe let me share with you also what are some of the principles that are part and the beginning, I would say, of this report. The first one has to do with collaboration. So the Reimagining Our Futures Together report actually calls for transforming the teaching profession as a collaborative one. So the issue of collaboration, of working together, collaboration vis-a-vis competition, most certainly is something that is embedded in the report. The second element has to do with lifelong learning. Not only because we learn throughout our lives from the cradle to the grave, because we learn beyond schools. Education is much more ample than that. And also because let's say the professionalization of teachers, the work of teaching also is conducive to lifelong learning. Teachers actually need to learn throughout life as well, and in that learning produce knowledge that they can use and that they can share. That has to do with recognizing teachers as knowledge producers, as policy partners. This is a very important principle because it's the change of paradigm, it's the change of mindsets, of thinking of teachers purely as implementers of curriculum and somebody else's decision, vis-a-vis having teachers in the front seat, speaking of what the needs are and contributing to educational decision making from the classroom to the school to the education system. That's the idea of having teachers as knowledge producers. But this important, let's say, these important tasks, this important shift in the work of teacher requires that their working conditions are commensurate to, particularly to the importance of the task. I don't know if we lost the room or maybe just they went mute, because I did see just want to make sure
Yes.
that we are being heard and seen.
Yes.
We are reconnecting.
Satej, can you please repeat?
We are just
We are not getting a good audio from your side. So can you confirm whether you are still able to view the presentation and the speaker's audio is
We are able to
coming
hear.
through?
They're able to hear.
Okay.
That's what I heard.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's see the chat.
Yes, we can continue.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Very good.
Thanks.
Yeah. It was lovely to see the audience. So if they can come back, it would be great to see them. But I'm glad that you can continue to follow the presentation. So as I was saying, this kind of like revisited importance of the work of teachers necessitates, working conditions that are improved, that are commensurate to the importance of their work. And as Archana was mentioning, the COVID-19 also made a good point on the importance of teachers, on the new appreciation of the work of teachers, which I believe we do have globally a good appreciation of the work of teachers, but the working conditions are not, coherent with that importance. And also, we have shortages of teachers, and that's what the report focuses on, which impacts education systems, the teachers' workloads and working conditions as well, and ultimately compromise education quality. So let me move to the next slide. There we go. So these are the figures globally. 6 years away from 2030, we are lacking 44 million teachers that are needed in the world just to provide universal primary and secondary education by 2030. Of this figure, 13 million are needed at primary education and 31 million are needed at secondary education. Now, this is a big shortage, and the shortage actually, when we look into the different regions, has different phases. First of all, because it's distributed differently. On the one hand, we have 15 million teachers that are needed, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, and then some 7 million that are needed in East Asia. But by 2030 globally, the report shows only 4 in 10 countries will have enough teachers for universal primary education. And this drops to fewer than 1 in 5 for secondary education. By means of our calculations, we consider that primary teacher numbers need to increase by over 10% annually. That is the size of the shortage. In primary education, the average pupil-teacher ratio for high-income countries is, for example, 15:1. But in many other countries, it is 55:1, 60:1, as is the case, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have a big shortage of teachers. And then when we look at, for example, early childhood education or higher education levels, specific areas of education, such as the arts or, for example, sciences, mathematics, we have a larger shortage. So the shortage has many phases. One of them is quantitative, and another one is qualitative. So the shortage in terms of quality has to do with the training of teachers, with teacher education and professional development, which is still lacking. The report shows that the global average of trained teachers is around 86% in primary education and 85% in secondary education. That's the global average. There has been an increase, we're happy to see, in India, for example, of qualified secondary teachers. So it is now 90% as of 2022, which has improved quite a bit in the past 5 years from the 76% that was shown in 2017. Now, in terms of pupil-teacher ratios, we have also observed a decline from 35 to 25 pupils per trained teacher in 2022 in the region. And this is partly reflected because of decreases in India, for example, from 44 to 32 students per qualified teacher. So those are some of the changes that have made important, I would say, improvements in terms of addressing the quality, addressing the shortage of teachers. But the shortage of teachers has different challenges and different implications. First, because it's a multidimensional phenomenon. I mean, on the one hand, we see, for example, highly populated countries, maybe India is the case. We know sub-Saharan Africa is another case in point, other places in South Asia, where the population has grown and continues to expand rapidly, which means that there is a demand for more schools, for more teachers, because we have more population, basically, more students. Also, in those countries where secondary education became mandatory very recently, for example, that also multiplied the need for teachers. Notwithstanding the population growth, one of the main causes for the teacher shortages is not demand. It's actually the fact that teachers are leaving the profession. So we do see globally that the attrition rates of teachers doubled between 2015 and 2022. So that is quite a phenomenon that we need to observe. The fact that teachers are leaving the profession, on the one hand, that they're not coming back, that they usually leave within the first 5 years of service, tells us something is not working in the way we are conceiving of the profession. Now, the factors or the reasons why teachers leave the profession can vary, from push to pull to personal factors. We have retirement, we have health, family obligations, but importantly, the working conditions, the well-being of teachers are among the causes for these rates of attrition. And when we talk about the working conditions, we talk on the one hand on the material conditions of teaching. So the salaries, the remuneration are very important, but also the symbolic condition. To what extent teachers are given voice, to what extent they participate in educational decision making, or are teachers told what to do, when to do it, they're inspected so that they do it, and that takes the attractiveness of the profession away from new generations as well that do not want to become teachers. And sometimes even in countries where the pay or the remuneration for teachers is actually high. Even in those places, we see a lot of attrition. For example, in Finland, there is a lot of attrition, and it does not have to do necessarily with the salaries, with the remuneration. Salaries do play a very important role, of course, because teachers need to make a living. But the salaries remain unattractive. The report shows that across the globe, half of the countries, 50% or more of the countries, pay primary teachers less than other professions requiring the same level of qualifications. So that's quite grave. That means that we're valuing the work of other professions and not so much the value of the teaching profession. Now, it is important to say as well that this has to do with teachers as a whole, but we know that in many countries, contract teachers earn significantly less than fixed-term civil service teachers. And every country has this phenomenon. In India, I believe it's 11%, the share of public sector teachers that are actually contract teachers. So, of course, the working conditions are more fragile, the remuneration is not the same, and this has, of course, implications in terms of how attractive people might find the profession. There's also an element that has to do with international mobility. That might be the case of India as well. But many countries like Canada, Germany, the UK, the USA, and others are pretty much attractive talent from different countries. So, for example, the report showed an example in the Caribbean of brain drain, where people were leaving their countries, teachers were leaving their countries to become teachers, for example, in the UK or in other countries that share a language. That might be the case of India with the English language proficiency of teachers. But we do know at least that is a case in point in the Caribbean. So as you can see, teachers leaving the profession has many phases. So it has to do with the working conditions, the remuneration, the mobility, the working opportunities. But at the end of the day, attrition, teachers leaving the profession, makes up for 58% of that shortage. Of those 44 million teachers, 58% is because teachers are leaving the profession. Another element which I wanted to share with you has to do with the gender dimension of these shortages. We know teaching is becoming an increasingly feminized profession, and we see that globally. However, women are underrepresented in higher education levels and leadership positions, and they face discrimination and unsafe working conditions in many countries. As you can see in the graph that you have on the screen, you can see, for example, in pre-primary education, it's mostly women that conform the teacher workforce. In some cases, like Eastern and Southeastern Asia, 97% of pre-primary teachers are female. But when one looks into secondary education, higher education, specific disciplines like STEM, for example, we see less teachers being represented. And when we look at leadership position, it's even less teachers that are female teachers that are represented there. So there is an issue of gender biases, there is an issue of discrimination, and particularly there is an issue to rethink. There's a need to rethink, our stereotypes, our gender prejudice as to whose responsibility is the upbringing of children and the education of the future generations. There seems to be around the world this trend of a feminized profession, but with different conditions. For example, in India, while women make up 44% of teachers in government and government-aided schools, they comprise 55% of those on contract, that means contractual teachers in government schools, and 59% in government-aided or concerted schools, who are, of course, earning lower salaries. This feminization pattern of the contractual workforce is repeated across different school types in India. So that is something that we need to look at, the representation of women in leadership, in higher education levels, and in particular areas of work. Now, the report not only looks at what are some of the causes of the global teacher shortages, but it looks at what are some of the policy solutions that have been implemented in the world to address some of these challenges. So one of them, of course, has to do with improving salaries, or for example, retirement schemes. So the better salaries do lead to more commitment and retention of the workforce in the system, as we have seen, for example, in the United Kingdom or in Kazakhstan or in Shanghai, where there is, for example, housing for rural teachers, when Kazakhstan doubled the recruitment of teachers in, I think it was in just 2 years' time. So these are some examples of, doubled the salaries of teachers in just 2 years' time. So these are some examples of countries making an effort to try to improve the salaries and the compensation of teachers. Now, the second element has to do with the integration of technologies. We have seen in a number of countries, including Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, how technology has been put at the service of teachers. So not only for teaching, but also for example, the monitoring, the management of the profession by means of technologies for more equitable deployment. Also to alleviate the burdens of teachers when it comes to doing paperwork, administrative procedures, and the rest. So technologies can be thought about to alleviate the issue of burdens, but certainly not to substitute teachers. That is a very important point. And an important point that we're making today at UNESCO, we are in the middle of Digital Learning Week, and one of the red lines that has been reiterated is that teachers are irreplaceable, and that we know. So while technology can support to alleviate the burden of teachers, it cannot replace the pedagogical knowledge and judgment that teachers bring to the classroom and to the schools. Now, training, mentoring, socio-emotional support is something that we have seen is very important in places during emergencies or in crisis-affected areas. We've seen that in Kenya, in Cameroon, in Peru, and in many places where there might be need for addressing and making enabling conditions, addressing violence and making enabling conditions for teachers. The participation of teachers in conversation with parents, with communities, with the school is something that can actually protect also these enabled environments there where they are at risk. That includes, for example, Liberia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, as some examples where we have seen committees forming to protect education from attack. Now, in terms of school leadership, there are practices that foster also collaboration among teachers. We've seen, I mean, when one looks at the many possibilities to improve the working conditions of teachers, many of them are outside the reach of school leaders, for example, because they require a better allocation of resources, because they require funds, because it's somebody else's decision at higher level. But school leaders at the school level can make a world of a difference for the working conditions of teachers. And that has to do, and we've seen in many cases how they have substituted the role of principal, of director, on inspector, and rather to provide mentoring and providing spaces for teachers to interact. We have seen even in Latin America, there's a report that UNESCO produces every 4 years on learning outcomes. We have also seen how this school leadership fostering collaboration among teachers actually has as a result the improvement of learning outcomes in the region. The same goes for induction programs that have become very important, welcoming teachers to the profession, embracing them as newcomers, mentoring them in their first years really leads to retention. Remember, it is within the first 5 years of the profession that teachers actually leave. So the mentoring, the onboarding processes are very important. We've seen examples in Chile, in Cuba, in Scotland, and in others. Now, as we said before, providing teacher autonomy and promoting teacher agency is also something that reflects very positively on their working conditions. You see, when teachers can make pedagogical decisions, when teachers can play a role in the lives of their school districts, of their provinces, of their ministries, and others, is really motivating. We found out that motivated teachers remain in the profession in India, for example, by means of an activity-based learning reform, which enhanced teacher ownership and buy-in for this new approach. There are examples of teacher autonomy as well. For example, in Finland, where the inspectorate, has been eliminated as a figure, and instead they trust in the work that teachers can actually do. And that's important. We need to trust the work of teachers. We need to trust in their ability to make pedagogical decisions, because that's what we train them for. That's what teacher education is all about. In terms of incentives, there have been a few. I mentioned already China, which brings, by means of housing projects or programs, teachers from urban to rural areas. In Ecuador is the same for indigenous communities. So there's a way of improving the representation and the working conditions of teachers. This includes migration. There's an example there from Barbados, but there are others, like in the CARICOM protocol for teacher recognition of qualifications, for example, so that they can actually work as they move along. Now, coming from the report and looking at the new social contract for education, there's 9 recommendations that came out of the report and that I wanted to share with you. The first of them is that we need to really have the profession reflect the diversity of their communities. And for that, we need to foster gender equality, and we need to improve the diversity of the profession. The diversity in terms of not only gender, but in diversity in terms of language, of culture, etc. The issue of language is quite a problem in a number of countries in the world, where teachers do not speak the language, the first language of their learners, for example. And as we said, in terms of addressing the gender imbalances, we've seen, for example, cases like Austria or Germany, where that have implemented initiatives to improve female leadership or recruit more men in early childhood education. In Germany, for example, the proportion of men working in early childhood education doubled in those 10 years. That can be done by putting the right policies and incentives in place. The second is that the motivation of teachers happens through collaborative and relevant lifelong learning opportunities. So teacher motivation also has to do with knowing how they are going to perform, with being prepared, with being trained for the work that they are to do. There are examples, there are many of them. We just put there one on England of a pilot project which actually promoted collaboration. We've seen in many countries, and I'm sure India is the case, the establishment of communities of practice, of exchange, where teachers can actually reflect and continue to learn throughout life. Teachers benefiting from technology, we said before, is also important. There's a professional academy for teachers, for example, that was set up in Egypt. There are different examples that are leveraging technology for the training of teachers so that they can actually use it to amplify their educational, the learner's educational experience, I would say. Also, enhancing teaching professionalization by means of teacher education, of continuous professional development. Here, there's a couple of examples in the African Union. There's a teacher qualification framework. We have a global competency framework for standards at UNESCO as well. But it is very important to consider that teaching is actually a profession that is done in practice, that it is by practicing teaching from the early ages of teacher education. It is by exchanging with others that we can actually embed continuous professional development in the classrooms and not necessarily depend on a university or a training center that might give you one particular training every now and then on a particular issue. It should be embedded, and I'll come back to that point. It should really be embedded and led by teachers. Another recommendation is to transition contract teachers into permanent teaching positions. We've seen examples in Indonesia, for example, integrated almost 600,000 teachers who were contractual, temporary, into permanent positions. 800,000 teachers were also transitioned into permanent positions in Mexico, for example. So there, the work of the unions, the government, the work of social dialogue is important for this to happen. The sixth recommendation has to do with finding a balance between accountability and autonomy. There is the Finnish case that I put before, the issue of trusting performance, of not having to have a standard testing to assess the performance of teachers, getting rid of the inspectorate. So it is important that teachers know what they need to do, that they are supported and trained so that they do, but that they're given agency to make these decisions in the classroom. The seventh recommendation is to motivate teachers through horizontal and vertical ladders to enhance professional growth. So, for example, the establishment of teaching careers that might have, as they usually do, a vertical axis, so basically social mobility, better salaries, better positions. Sometimes it comes through seniority, sometimes through competency frameworks. But there should be also horizontal ladders in allowing teachers to participate, for example, in material and curriculum design, in assessment, in mentoring. So a teacher can excel at teaching, but within teaching, there's many more things that a teacher can do. And that is also motivating, just having, however good and loving a teacher might be, if they are stuck in the classroom teaching the same lesson for 15 years, it becomes a little bit boring. So trusting that teachers can actually support other areas of education practice, other areas even of education policy, is something important. We have an example there of Lithuania, where there are career ladders that have both horizontal and vertical mobility. There are other examples in the report as well. The eighth recommendation has to do with fostering idea sharing and innovation through collaboration. Again, the issue of communities of practice. There's an example of Rwanda there, leading teaching and learning together to boost motivation, problem solving. There's a national policy in Korea, for example, to create communities of practice. As much as teachers can collaborate, can produce together, we arrive at better solutions. We also engage teachers in a more exciting work, as we said before, of knowledge production. And this knowledge, finally, can be used to engage in educational decision making. We need to think of teachers as public intellectuals, as policy partners that can actually make a difference from the knowledge that they have. And finally, it is very important for this to happen that we invest in teachers. This means closing the funding gap there is. Beginning with public expenditure on education, the data from 2021 shows that around 4% of the GDP is used globally, but you might remember that there are actually benchmarks, international recommendations, by which governments should spend at least 6% of the GDP, or 20% of their public expenditure should be dedicated to education. So first of all, we need to raise the bar and make sure that countries are fulfilling the commitment of financing education to the international benchmarks. Especially in the case of teachers, because as you may know, the allocations for public funds from government constitute about 78% of global education spending. Now, donors are still 13% or so, but most of the funds for education come, luckily, from public funds. And within these funds, teacher salaries make up the vast majority of that expenditure. So in many countries, up to 85, 90% of the budget is just the salaries of teachers, however bad, however low, but it is just the salaries of teachers, which leaves very little money then to promote the communities of practice, to promote teacher continuous professional development, etc. So all of these transformations that we're talking about, they also require more and better directed investment. In some countries, the debt crisis and debt stress actually prevents them from doing this. There are many countries that have to service debt and who actually spend a higher percentage of the GDP in paying debt than investing in education. And that is something that the financial institutions should look into. And finally, attrition rates at the end, teachers leaving the profession is both more costly for the schools, but also for the education systems. There's an estimation in the UK, for example, that 208 million pounds a year were spent training teachers that quit within the first 2 years after qualifying. A study in the US, a recent study showed that some $20,000 are needed for every teacher that leaves the profession just to qualify another teacher to actually enter. So there's this kind of ratios of funding which are important to look at. When we look at the 44 million teachers that are missing globally, the funds that are needed to address this shortage is of $120 billion a year. So it is a huge challenge that necessitates, of course, of international collaboration. The needs in sub-Saharan Africa alone is about $40 billion US. So it is a huge figure that is needed. And the shortage of teachers is such a large phenomenon that we need to mobilize the international community. We need international collaboration to address this. And this is where the recommendations of the high-level panel on the teaching profession come in. I will not delve into them because you will be talking about them tomorrow, but just to say that our global report also takes into consideration this recommendation and urges to dignify, diversify, and valorize the teaching profession. So I'm hoping that this was clear. There's a QR code that you can use to download our report, which is for free, which is online, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Vargas. This was a very thought-provoking presentation. I'll give a couple of minutes for the audience to organize their questions, comments, and also for those who are joining us virtually to type in their questions in the chat or raise their hand. And before I open the floor to allow these questions and comments, I'll just take a couple of minutes to point out what stood out to me, although it's very difficult to, there are a number of things that struck me. These are not questions, just a few observations. I was quite struck by the principle of advocated in Futures of Education report, which you pointed all of us to, which is looking at putting teachers in the front seat, not just as a teacher, but also as a knowledge producer and as a policy partner. And in some sense, actually empowering them as change agent in this agenda of transforming education. And it would be really interesting to see what that would look like, what that role of the teacher would look like. The second thing that struck me was that although teacher conditions and challenges vary significantly by regions across the world, there are several common themes that seem to emerge regarding the roles that the teachers play, the recognition that they receive, and the challenges that they are confronted with. And the first one I see, which you also pointed out as a key lever to reverse teacher shortages, the point on improving teacher salaries and introducing retirement schemes. And this is closely linked to the last slide on financing. And because we are currently confronted with challenges of finding finances to reach SDG 4. And in this case, we are talking about target 4C specifically. And we know that there is an annual financing gap to meet SDG 4 targets, which is almost, from the more recent estimate, seems to be about 100 billion per year. And we do not know where these funds will come from. And although we know that the state remains the primary funder because education is a fundamental right in India and a human right globally, and the state is duty bound, therefore, to protect and respect and fulfill this right to education, there seems to be a race to the bottom because we do see an increased contractual appointments and para-teachers where the salaries are almost at par with what is offered in private low-fee paying schools, and terms are short-term. So how do you really reconcile these figures, and where will this money come from is another challenge for all of us to look into. And the teacher shortages, as you said, is really a pressing concern. And what struck me is that it is a concern worldwide. I mean, no region is spared of this, regardless of the income of the country. The reasons could differ, but this is a pressing concern worldwide. And a large part of it is due to attrition. So one needs to really look at disaggregating what is the reason for, what category of teachers, those who are experienced, those who are newly inducted into the teacher workforce. And I think this is something that also struck me. And lastly, I think we are looking at target 4C as a critical means of implementation, calling for a substantial increase in the supply of qualified teachers. But I'm wondering, and it's good that this report will get published every couple of years using a thematic approach, but it would be also interesting to identify whether the existing metrics that we use to monitor this progress, are these metrics adequate? And I do see that the report has talked about pupil-trained teacher ratio in addition to just pupil-teacher ratio. So what kind of new metrics might be required for us to capture? Because we do see PTR is improving, but what does that mean? Do we need new metrics? I'll stop here, and I already see some hands being raised in the audience, and feel free to also pass the mic around in the room, in the auditorium. and please feel free to come in. I will take a couple of questions and then we'll invite Dr. Vargas to respond. Identify yourself when you ask your question, please. And there is a request if the videos, if those who wish to ask the question virtually, if the videos of those who are asking the question can be turned on. But that is for the organizers to see if that is feasible. But please,
Good
who would
evening.
like to go first? Yeah.
Good evening, sir. It was a very insightful presentation. I'm Palak and I'm currently pursuing B.Ed. from CET. So my question was that given the critical global challenge of teacher shortage that also is highlighted in the report, what specific innovative strategies could be implemented by the policymakers, not only to attract new teachers, but also to retain experienced educators, and particularly in those areas such as undeserved and remote communities, where the impact of this shortage is most severe?
Thank you, Palak. Maybe we could take one more question from the floor. Those who are joining virtually, please feel free to raise your hand or type in your question or comment in the chat box.
Good evening. My name is Mohammed Rashid. I'm second year B.Ed. student. And my question is on the report mentioning a term teacher as a knowledge producer, but we get any information and knowledge from internet and AI help us to produce the knowledge. Then what UNESCO mean by this term, and in what context behind featuring like teacher as a producer? I think apart from knowledge producer, teacher is a value producer, value of humanity and value of justice and etc. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vargas. Would you like to respond?
Indeed. I think. Thank you for your questions. There was one also in the chat about the point that we need to trust teachers even when we see that learning outcomes are not as good as they could probably be. So I'll try to respond. Maybe let me begin with the last question / comment around knowledge producers and value producers. So two things are important to consider there. First, and it's a very important point, that teachers are not only, and this is important when we think of education, the function of education is not only qualification. It is not only knowledge acquisition. One of the most important purposes of education has to do with socialization, with subjectification, with identity formation, with instilling, in students responsibility for themselves, for others, and for the world. So indeed, these are the values that teachers need to have and that need to live by, modeling by example these values in terms of what education is for. So very important point to consider that education is not only about qualifications and marks and grades, it is about living together, doing so peacefully, as we said, collaboration, pedagogies of solidarity, of compassion, etc. So I fully agree with the fact that teachers are value producers, as you have mentioned. But they are knowledge producers as well. There's a lot of knowledge in the internet, and in this day and age, even some of the conversations 2 days ago here in Paris on digital learning week have been about, now that we can put the curriculum online, we can digitize materials, we have ChatGPT and artificial intelligence that can produce knowledge. What is the role of the teacher? And in a panel yesterday, we defended the same point. We said the teacher role is even more important today than before the rise of technologies, because the critical thinking, the discernment of what is valuable, important, and what is fake news is something that needs to be also developed. The ability to think critically, to tell apart what's valuable information from what is not, and to guide the learning process now is more difficult than before the rise of technologies. So I think it's important to consider that. Now, the previous question had to do with how do we retain educators or recruit educators in underserved areas. So some of the examples that we have shared have to do, for example, with the deployment of teachers and trying to address the inequality in that deployment. As we know, very usually the best teachers are in the best schools, and the best schools are in the more affluent areas. And of course, you know, the schools in wealthy urban areas will attract the best teachers, and rural areas which are impoverished, where there are systems and services that are missing, will not. So that requires different ways of looking at the issue of deployment. On the one hand, we need to ensure that the most knowledgeable and experienced teachers, they work where they are needed most. So that means in those underserved, underprivileged areas. How do we do that? We can do that by means of incentives, for example. I was mentioning the example of China, but there are many others in which there are incentives, sometimes economic incentives, sometimes career points towards professional development, where teachers can be placed in a rural community, given housing, etc., etc. And the other one has to do with recruitment. We also need to recruit from those regions that teachers actually come from, especially if we want to be, if we want to promote the relevance of education, sometimes even culturally and linguistically, we need to recruit locally as well from those communities, which means that teacher education needs to reach every corner of a country or any given geography. And the issue of the trust in teachers is an important question. Without a doubt, we know what the obligations of teachers are. We can measure, we can monitor the progress that learners make. Now, it's easy to blame the teacher for the lack of performance or for the low performance of students, but we know that in reality, this responds to a multiplicity of factors, some of which are beyond the reach of the teacher. And these include social services, sanitation in the schools, the facilities, I mean, even the household, the proximity of the school, whether there's a school transport, the conditions in the household to do independent study. So first of all, we need to disentangle why the students are underperforming. And secondly, identify the areas where they are underperforming. Because if we go back to the last questions that was asked about the production of values and not only knowledge, what we need to identify then is that teachers are actually working towards the development of full spectrum individuals, and sometimes the learning outcomes are only expressed by means of mathematics and reading and writing, perhaps. And education is much more than just cognitive and much more than just numbers and reading. There are many areas of learning that teachers might achieve that do not get evaluated. For example, we were talking about socialization or citizenship or participation. It's not something that you take a test for. It's not something that gets accounted for. And that has to do with the very quality of education. So we need to reverse that narrative as to the quality of education and include those patterns. I'll stop right there. There were a number of questions, maybe from Archana that you have raised. I don't know if I should address them now, or do we give room for other questions?
There are 3 questions in the chat box. I think we could take those three and then again have another round of questions being asked from the room. So one is, the first one is by Jani Reddy Pandiri, who's asking, how will we compare teachers from Finland and teachers working in the global south in terms of autonomy and competencies? Shilpi Gill is asking a question specifically drawing from the PISA 2022 observation, which is looking at student well-being as well, and is asking, shouldn't well-being be included in the continuous professional development and policies pertaining to teachers, and not limiting the training just to competency building, pedagogy, and so on. And what are some of the measures a school leader can take in order to ensure teachers' well-being, because teachers' well-being did come across also in the report. And Lokesh Rao Jadhav is asking, how are we looking at education as a process beyond a quantitative matrix, and is centralized and decentralized notions of quality, looking at psychological and physical statistics during the policy reformation process. And I think this is to do with looking at how we define quality and what is seen as an important marker of quality.
For which we will need another 2 hours to answer. But let me try to answer them in that order that they were asked. So the first one has to do with teacher autonomy and teacher competencies. How can we compare Finland or any other country with teachers working in the global south? Now, it's a good question. First of all, because we need to look at teaching as a whole and the working conditions of teachers as a whole. So first you need to consider the training that takes place and what is required to enter the profession. For example, in Finland, one becomes a teacher only after doing a master's in education can one qualify to teach. And there are many countries where one qualifies to teach with a secondary education diploma. So just to see, in terms of competencies, there's a wide range there of difference. Our vision is, and I think the world is moving in that direction, is that teachers should be trained at least at higher education level and not at middle level. So that's one important point. The second one has to do with possibly kind of the relationship there is between teachers and managers, which is, and this is something that does not need to happen in highly wealthy countries. And here we're talking about the way that teachers can actually be given autonomy in practice, and then how this percolates into the system. So in practice, that means how do we trust the work of teachers, and therefore how do we not inspect, but rather something that I mentioned just by passing in the presentation is how we transform this bureaucracy of inspection, or the bureaucratic role of a school director, which by definition directs or inspects, into one that actually mentors. And that links with one of the questions that you had about school leaders. There's a number of issues that school leaders can do to actually amplify the agency and the autonomy of teachers. One of them is providing enabling environments, having a school and a governance model in which teachers participate in educational decision making. This has to do with the very organization of schooling, whether it is how long classes last, when do we have breaks, how do we blend a mathematics class with a music class, or how do we leave the school to go and do, let's say, a visit of a market to understand. I don't know. There's 1,000 things that can be done. Of course, if the principals have the autonomy and can pass it on to the teachers as well. Now, the question of well-being is an important one. It is true, and it should be part and parcel of teacher training, but also of teacher management, I would say. First of all, we need to consider that the well-being of teachers is very important if they are to promote the well-being of students. And here we have, and I'll link that with the question on quality. We very often think of the role of teacher as instruction. And we very rarely think of the role of teacher as companionship, as mentoring, as looking into the well-being of their students, looking at what are some of the lived experiences of learners, particularly, for example, in more vulnerable situations, and what are some of the constraints that they face in order to develop, in order to learn better. The predispositions with which they arrive at school is something that we need to look at. And that leads me probably to the fourth question on the quality of education. Now, that is a philosophical one, but I can attempt an answer to how we think of quality of education, and therefore what are the metrics that we use to evaluate learning, to evaluate teachers, to evaluate schools and education systems altogether. There is a very old paper which I like very much. It's by Harvey and Green, and it is about the definition of quality. What are the different notions of quality that have been used in education and in different systems? And they start by different, taxonomies and defining quality as excellence, for example. And the issue of excellence itself being problematic, to what extent that promotes competition rather than collaboration, exceptionality instead of commonality. So there's quality as excellence, there's quality as fitness for purpose. To what extent an education system is fit to fulfill the purpose of the system, which is the qualification of the students, etc., which is very technical. And that's why you look at the metrics we have today for quality. They are based on these notions of excellence, of exceptionality, of fitness for purpose, of qualification, but they leave aside many of the metrics of the ultimate purpose of education, which is about the transformation of selves and the transformation of society for better and amplified well-being. And I believe it is in that definition and what the authors call quality as transformation. Is probably a better measure that can explain and can expand the metrics that we use today to assess the learning of students, to assess the performance of teachers, to assess the effectiveness of schools, etc. So I think that is a long path to follow, but one that we can certainly begin with when we think about the role of teachers in education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vargas. Maybe we have time for just a quick question from the audience, those who are in the auditorium. Maybe if there is one, just one or two very quick ones.
Should I go, Archana?
Yes, please.
So thank you, Mr. Carlos, for that beautifully presented stats on the status of the teacher globally. You mentioned that teachers union played a role with respect to, wherever there are better practices being implemented. So I just wanted to know, has there been any study which kind of gives us a landscape of teachers union and their, visible decline across the globe? And if they're important, then what is it that can be done to build those unions back?
Thanks, Richa. Any other question from the audience attending in person, or else there is one by Indrajit Datta here who's asking about feminization of teaching profession, and Indrajit is asking, have you also looked into, has the report also looked into why women are not in academic leadership positions? And I can see there is one last question from the audience, and then we will have to end. Yes, go ahead, Bindu. Your mic is not on.
Sorry, my name is Bindu, and I was about to ask a similar question about teacher unions. And I wanted to know your experience of how teacher unions have transformed globally. And what do you think their future is, and how would you think they would be able to effectively organize themselves as unions in the future? Yeah.
Thanks. I think that would be it. We won't have time for any more questions. Apologies for that. But over to you, Dr. Kha. What is your response?
Thank you. Thanks for the questions, both from the room and from the chat. I think they're very, very interesting. Let me begin with the one on social dialogue and the role of teacher unions. And when you meet with Oliver tomorrow, is a question that you can really ask the International Labour Organization, because they have a definition for social dialogue. They define social dialogue as any interaction, negotiation relating to anything concerning the work of any particular worker. So this is across the systems and across the sectors. What does that mean to us in education? And what is the interpretation of social dialogue that teacher unions do? For us in education means that the matter of conversation and negotiation, which is tripartite between government, unions, and employers, unions who represent the teachers certainly, and employers, has to do with anything that affects their everyday work, anything that affects their profession. And that's very easy if you're a medical doctor, if you're an engineer, if you're a carpenter, that's very easy to know what affects your profession. If you're a teacher and if you work in education, a reform can affect your work. A change in curriculum can affect the work that you do. A school directive can affect your everyday work. So what does that mean? That means that teachers, and this is something that unions need to open up to, that the negotiation that is beyond collective bargaining. So the interest of unions should not be only to defend the salaries of teachers. Of course, it's very important, but the conditions affecting the work of teachers are many. All of the ones that we mentioned, which means that teachers should have voice and participation in those processes affecting their profession. So from there, we understand that teachers need to participate in curricular reform. They need to participate in the assessment of teaching and the tests for performance. They need to participate in the life of the communities, in the budgetary decisions, etc., etc., etc. So basically to say, we need to understand that the participation of teachers goes beyond the negotiation of their collective contract, you see? And it should go into areas that affect their work, but not only because it affects the work, but because they can contribute. Teachers can contribute with their knowledge, with their expert practitioner knowledge of the realities of their classrooms, of their learners, of their communities to improve education. So that is the potential of social dialogue. That's why World Teachers Day on the 5th of October, the 4th this year, will be on teacher voice. It's precisely about giving voice and prominence to teachers beyond, the collective bargaining, the negotiation of better salaries. It is about participating in education altogether. Now, as to the role that teacher unions play for that varies heavily from country to country. We will have a paper on social dialogue coming out on the 4th of October, which I invite you to visit in our website. It will be ready by then. But there's a couple of passages on teacher unions that we included in the global report that you can read online. And I lost track of the other question, Archana. One was on social dialogue. The other was on gender, was it?
Yes, on feminization, it is in the chat box, which is asking, has the report looked into the factors why women are not in positions of academic leadership?
Okay, but that has a very simple question. It has to do with discrimination. It has to do with the discrimination of women in the public sphere, and education is no exception. Again, it has to do with how we think that it's women who should raise the children. That's why in early childhood you have 97% of teachers are female. It has to do with prejudice as to the responsibility of upbringing, of the household, etc., etc. So the reasons for that is very clear. It has to do with greater biases, prejudices that discriminate against women, that they are not in decision-making positions. It's about glass ceilings. It is about rethinking the role that women can play. It's at the end of the day, it is about gender equality. So that's the reasons behind it. Now, what can we do about that? We can do, for example, a couple of the countries that I have exemplified this point by have developed affirmative action policies by which the recruitment of teachers in ECCE will be male by some years, by some time. The certain number of leadership positions have to be female by regulation. Affirmative action are very useful policy tools that, as you know, are temporary in nature, that can level the field in terms of equality. So that's one way of doing it. The other one is, of course, promoting the vocation of female teachers to become school leaders, or of young women to become teachers, and to become teachers, for example, in science, in technical and vocational education, in other areas where women are underrepresented. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vargas. I think we are quite close to the time. So I'm sorry we are not able to take any more questions. I wanted to thank Dr. Vargas for highlighting some of these key challenges that the teaching profession is experiencing globally, and also for addressing all the questions and comments very patiently and elaborately. I think it's very important that we've had this dialogue today, because I see we have just 5 more years to reach Sustainable Development Goals, and it involves addressing a range of complex and interrelated challenges, as we heard today. Thank you, Dr. Vargas, for pointing these out. And I'm sure all of us are also quite keen to witness what emerges from the United Nations General Assembly session that will be happening later this month, where there are certain critical documents that will get accepted, adopted, and we would like to see how teachers and teachers' roles and positions are covered and referred to in these documents. I would also like to thank the participants both who have joined us virtually from different parts of the world, and also those who have been present at the campus. I know it is late evening, a long day after the classes. Thank you all for being present and for your active engagement this evening. I would like to hand over to the organizers for all the closing formalities, and I see there is a photograph that is suggested. So over to you for suggesting and giving instructions on how to go about that. Thank you.
So I will simply echo what Professor Mahendale has already said, that indeed a very rich and stimulating presentation. And we are very grateful to you, Dr. Vargas, for setting us on the path of this series of talks, Global Talk series celebrating teachers. So we've had a very enthusiastic start to this series, and you have already set up the the curiosity for tomorrow's talk, which is going to be delivered by Dr. Oliver Liang, who is head of the Public and Private Services Unit of Sectoral Policies Department of the International Labour Organization, Geneva, Switzerland. And he will be speaking about the recommendations of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on the teaching profession. So I hope you will all join us, and same time tomorrow here. And those of you who have joined us online, so thank you very much for your wonderful participation, and thank you all who are gathered here for your participation as well. Thank you very much. And I mustn't forget, I almost forgot. Thank you so much, Archana, for your wonderful chairing of the session. This was really, really appreciated. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.